Ivy Walsh came up the servants' stair with ink on both gloves and a folded contract pressing against her wrist like a second pulse. The paper still warm from the clerk's sandshaker because she had signed it less than an hour earlier, and handed away her legal claim to Walsh Shipping in exchange for 1 year of wages paid directly into her own hand. She could still smell the counting house on herself. Lamp oil, damp wool, iron from wet coins. And she knew, with a steadiness that made her throat ache, that there was no path backward now. Her father's office had been hers in law, briefly. Now she was a paid copyist in the business he had built. The kitchen maid looked up when Ivy entered by the back passage and at once lowered her eyes, not from disrespect, but from caution, as if even sympathy might be taxed in this house. Ivy set her ledger satchel beside the scullery door, rinsed her fingertips in a basin gone cloudy with starch water, and asked for no tray to be carried up. She took her own supper standing beside the stove, 2 heel slices and broth gone thin, because anything served at the family table after she had chosen employment arrived as performance. The household had learned Lenora Walsh's new sentence and repeated it in softened versions. Miss Ivy preferred practical work. Miss Ivy had no taste for marriage. Miss Ivy was unsuited to the demands of society. Lenora never softened it. She said in drawing rooms and chapel vestibules, and to any woman who asked with careful politeness, that her daughter had chosen employment because she was unfit for marriage. The next morning, the tea at Ivy's place was cold when the covers were lifted, though steam rose from her mother's cup and from the cup set before Mr. Pollard, their solicitor, who had arrived before 8 with his leather folio and his habit of not looking directly at women when he discussed their futures. Lenora wore deep plum silk despite the early hour, her rubies fastened at throat and wrist as if breakfast were a negotiation. Ivy's gown, newly altered at the shoulders without her consent, pulled when she reached for bread. She sat straight, hands in her lap until spoken to. "You have done one sensible thing," Lenora said, buttering toast with a measured hand. "Wages are cleaner than dependence. You will continue in that office until the marriage articles are complete." Ivy looked at the untouched jam dish, and then at Mr. Pollard's folio. "With whom, mother?" "With Mr. Alton Brigg. You met him at Whitson's supper." She had met him, a creditor with silver at his temples, a careful mouth, and fingers that tapped the stem of his glass when anyone else spoke, as if patience itself were his property. He was 52 if he was a day. Ivy was 24. Mr. Pollard cleared his throat. "A prudent arrangement, Miss Walsh. Existing obligations may be consolidated under one household. Stability serves everyone." Lenora did not glance up. "Debt requires structure. Sentiment has already cost us enough." Ivy kept her voice level. "I will not discuss this before the servants." "They are polishing silver 10 yards away," Lenora replied. "They have ears, not authority." The butler entered to replace a plate and moved with deliberate silence, eyes fixed on the sideboard. Ivy could feel heat rising under her collar, then draining away so quickly her fingers numbed. She did not argue further. Not at breakfast. Argument fed Lenora, who liked to win before noon. After chapel, the carriage did not return by the market road as it had for years. It turned instead through narrower streets where fewer acquaintances could call up, and where Ivy could not ask to stop at the printer's or the bindery. Lenora kept the household purse, the dowry trust, and the keys to the correspondence cabinet in her private sitting room. Since her husband's burial, she had moved each mechanism of control with bureaucratic calm, never once raising her voice, never once announcing punishment as punishment. She had simply altered routes, reduced allowances, reassigned footmen, and placed a cousin's son in the role of escort whenever Ivy left the house. Constraint settled around Ivy one practical change at a time until it felt less like pressure and more like architecture. By the end of that week, even her father's portrait in the morning room had been turned to face the wall. Ivy corrected it once, after dinner. She crossed the carpet, set her fingers under the gilt frame, and turned him back toward the firelight. His painted eyes were grey and patient. His painted mouth held the near smile he wore when she recited freight tallies without error. She stood there long enough to hear the clock strike once from the hall. When she returned from washing her hands, the portrait faced the wall again. No one admitted to touching it. No one needed to. In the carriage ledger, where household movements were recorded in a narrow, disciplined hand, Lenora had begun writing Ivy's name beside entries she had not authorized. Tea with Mrs. Brigg, Thursday. Call at Brigg House, Saturday. Dressmaker fitting, Monday, bridal whites. The word appeared between ink blots as if it had always belonged to her. Ivy uncapped a pen, added freight figures in the margin of her own work pages, and said nothing while her cousin Edwin waited by the door, pretending not to read over her shoulder. "You ought to be grateful," he said at last, with the mild impatience of a man paid to repeat another person's will. "Mr. Brigg is established." Ivy sanded the line she had just written and capped the pen. "So is mildew." He stared, uncertain whether she had insulted him. She rose, gathered the ledger and passed him without brushing his sleeve. At the docks, Walsh shipping still smelled like her father's world. Rope tar, citrus from imported crates, wet oak, and men shouting over gulls and tide. Yet her place had been reduced to a narrow desk near the rear windows, where junior clerks copied manifests and corrected arithmetic done badly in haste. The partners greeted her with brittle courtesy, more careful now that wages, not inheritance, explained her presence. 2 of them had attended her christening. Neither met her eyes for long. She worked cleanly. She checked every cargo line twice. She kept one candle unlit each night and carried it home wrapped in paper, because wax had become another thing she rationed. Her wages came on Fridays in envelopes sealed with office paste. She tucked each one into a stitched pocket inside her bodice before she stepped into the street, as if money earned by her hand might evaporate in air controlled by her mother. The first envelope she opened in private had made her laugh once, without humour. 1 year of wages. Payment for surrendering the room where she had learned to read ledgers at 12, seated on a stool beside her father's knee. What Lenora did not know, what she had taken pains to prevent Ivy from learning, was how carefully Edmund Walsh had drafted every clause before he died, how many copies he had made, and where one of those copies had been sent. Ivy knew only fragments from whispered references and interrupted conversations. A sentimental condition, Pollard had called it with contempt one afternoon. A father's indulgence, Lenora had said. No one told her what the condition required. No one handed her the paper itself. On Tuesday evening, she returned from the counting house by the servants' stair again, because Lenora had informed the household that the front entrance would now be reserved for guests and family in proper condition, and ink-stained gloves did not qualify. Ivy paused at the mirror in the lower hall, long enough to remove the gloves, fold them, and tuck them into her satchel. Ink marked the heel of her palm and the side of her thumb. She rubbed at it with a linen square until the skin reddened. The stain remained. When she entered the drawing room at 7:30, Lenora and Mr. Pollard sat by the grate reviewing draft papers. The table between them held tea, untouched cakes, and a silver inkstand that had belonged to Ivy's grandmother. Ivy stopped just inside the door, neither advancing nor retreating. She had not been announced. She never waited for announcement now. Lenora did not invite her to sit. You are late. The tide delayed unloading. You are not paid to monitor weather. You are paid to copy. Ivy let the rebuke pass. I require access to my trust account statements for the quarter. Mr. Pollard shifted in his chair, eyes fixed on his folio clasp. Lenora turned one page, then another. Unnecessary. It is my trust. It is managed. Lenora lifted her gaze at last. Her eyes were dark, polished, incurious. You will marry where the debt requires. 4 words would have sufficed. Ivy chose 3. I heard you. She crossed to the sideboard, poured her own tea, though it had gone bitter with oversteeping, and drank it standing. Her hand remained steady until she set down the cup. Then she felt the tremor begin at the base of her thumb and climb into her wrist. She closed both hands around the back of a chair until the tremor passed. Outside, carriage wheels hissed on damp stone. Somewhere beyond the house, a church bell marked the half-hour. Ivy understood with a clarity so clean it frightened her that Lenora would not argue because argument implied equality. Lenora issued verdicts because verdicts required only compliance. This was the shape of the life prepared for her. Escorted calls, reviewed letters, a husband selected to settle accounts, and the gradual erosion of anything that had once belonged solely to her name. She did not ask permission. She left the room, went upstairs, and opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Inside lay the last cufflink her father had given her, 1 plain carpet bag, and a spare lantern wrapped in old muslin to keep the glass from cracking. She touched the lantern handle and then withdrew her hand. Not tonight, but soon. 3 days later, she stepped out of Walsh Shipping at dusk with ink on her cuffs, wages hidden against her ribs, and the spare lantern in her satchel, because the lower lane flooded after dark. The footman assigned to collect her had been called elsewhere by order entered in the ledger that morning in Lenora's hand. Ivy read the entry, closed the book, and walked alone. At St. Jude's, the church steps rose pale above the street mud, and a man stood halfway in shadow with a labourer's coat darkened by rain and posture, too disciplined for any dockhand she had known. Ivy tightened her grip on the satchel and kept moving, each sense sharpened, each breath measured, living inside the consequence of her own signature and the narrow road it had opened. Ivy tightened her grip on the satchel until the edge of the ledger board pressed into her palm, then shifted her path half a pace away from the church wall, giving the man distance without granting him her back. He did not move toward her. He stood with his weight balanced like a trained fighter, head slightly turned as if listening to more than the street offered, and she caught a brief line of pale skin at his throat where rain had darkened the collar. A labourer's coat patched at one shoulder, boots too well maintained for a dock drudge. She kept walking. At the corner by the cooper's yard, she looked once over her shoulder. The man had descended 2 steps and taken the same direction, not close enough to threaten, not far enough to dismiss. A watchful distance. She measured it by lamplight pools. 12 yards, 10. Back to 12 when she slowed. By the time she reached Walsh House by the rear gate, her jaw ached from holding still. She entered through the service passage, set down her satchel on the scrubbed pine bench, and checked the stitched pocket inside her bodice before she removed her cloak. Wages still there. Lantern unbroken. Nothing lost except the illusion that she moved unseen. Mrs. Dobb, the housekeeper, met her at the foot of the kitchen stairs with a folded napkin and an expression trained into neutrality over 30 years. Your mother asks that you present yourself in the blue sitting room. At once. The blue sitting room had once been used for music and summer tea. Lenora had converted it into an anteroom for decisions, with straight-backed chairs and no fire unless guests were present. Tonight, The grate was cold. Mr. Pollard sat beside the escritoire, his folio open, a page weighted by Lenora's glove. Lenora did not offer preamble. You were unescorted. The footman was reassigned. I reassigned him. Lenora's voice held no anger, only administrative patience. You will not make a habit of walking after dusk without household protection. Ivy removed her gloves finger by finger and set them in her lap, ink side inward. Household protection appears selective. Mr. Pollard looked down at his papers with sudden interest. Lenora folded her hands. Rubies flashed at her cuffs. You are not in a position to be difficult. Mrs. Brigg expects you Thursday at 2. You will wear the cream walking dress. The green has been altered out of use. The green had been her father's favourite because it brought colour to her face. Ivy kept her expression composed. As you wish. Lenora reached for a second page. You will sign preliminary marriage schedules next week. Final articles by Michaelmas. Mr. Brigg prefers efficiency. Ivy's fingers went cold, then colder, though the room held stale summer heat. She heard herself speak in a voice steadier than she felt. I have not agreed. Lenora's eyes lifted, dark and incurious. Agreement is a luxury purchased by liquidity. We are purchasing stability. Ivy rose. I require nothing further tonight. You require everything, Lenora said, and turned back to the folio. Ivy left before her pulse reached her throat. Upstairs, in the narrow bedroom that had once belonged to an aunt no one mentioned, she untied the stitched pocket, counted her notes, and tucked them beneath the false bottom of her washstand drawer, beside a bundle of copying nibs and 2 candles cut in half. She crossed to the wardrobe. 3 gowns remained serviceable. 2 had been altered at the bodice to mimic matronly lines she had not chosen. 1 pair of walking boots had been resoled with inferior leather that drank water through the seams. Constraint was no longer argument. It was accounting. Before she slept, she went to the morning room in her shift and robe, lifted her father's portrait from the wall hook, and turned it toward the room once more. The painted eyes were grey, attentive. She did not touch the face. She touched only the frame and returned upstairs barefoot, carrying her shoes so the boards would not announce her. At breakfast the next morning, her tea was cold again. Edwin stood by the sideboard with his cousinly concern arranged like a cravat. Lenora dictated carriage entries between bites of toast. Call on Mrs. Brigg, fitting at Bellamy's, chapel on Sunday, no market detours. Ivy copied freight numbers from memory on a scrap beneath the tablecloth, while Pollard discussed liquidation exposure as though she were not present. At the office, the clerk nearest the windows passed her a stack of manifests with one brow raised, testing whether she would object to twice the usual load. She took them without comment, corrected his sums by noon, then copied 3 coal bills and a tea invoice while gulls shrieked over wet pilings. At 1 o'clock she ate bread crust and apple peel in the record's alcove rather than the common table, because men spoke freely there about women and debt, and she preferred the company of ledgers. By the second evening after she had seen the man at St. Jude's, she knew the new shape of her days with punishing precision. Work until dusk, slip wages into the stitched pocket, exit by servant's stare. Decline offered rides from men who pitied or speculated. Walk the upper road if the tannery ditch overflowed. Enter through the rear gate, accept instructions. Hide money. Repair one thing quietly. Sleep in intervals. She had not seen the stranger again that first night. She had looked for him the following evening and found only 2 boys playing dice on the church steps and a woman with onions in her apron crossing toward Crown Lane. The absence had not soothed her. It had sharpened her attention to every footfall behind her. Tonight, rain started before she left the counting house, needling against the panes in diagonal silver lines. She wrapped the spare lantern in oiled cloth, tucked it under her arm, and stepped into the street as clerks shouted for cabs. She walked because walking was the only movement Lenora did not fully command. St. Jude's rose from the wet like carved bone. Pale stone darkened at the base where water pooled. Halfway up the steps, the same man stood in the same labourer's coat, rain tracing the brim of his hat. He faced outward, not toward her, as if he had taken post rather than shelter. Ivy stopped at the foot of the steps. He turned. His eyes were a clear, arresting grey-green, the colour of deep water under cloud, and whatever they revealed was not threat, but calculation held in leash. She had seen eyes like that once before, in officers returning through the docks after war, men who counted exits before conversation. "Sir," she said, because she would not show uncertainty first, "if you mean to follow me, do so plainly." He inclined his head, not mocking. "I mean to see that you reach home untroubled." "I have not requested an escort." "No." The word was precise. "You have not." A cart rattled past, wheels cutting dirty water over her hem. Ivy looked down at the muddy splash, and then back at him. "Then we understand one another. Good evening." She moved to go around him, choosing the lower lane out of stubbornness and speed. He stepped down one stair, still not blocking, merely close enough that she had to acknowledge him. "Miss Walsh, the lane ahead floods by the tannery. Take the upper road." She went still. Rain struck the lantern glass in a hard, irregular beat. He had used her name in full, without hesitation, in the accent of a formally educated man. Not dockside, not casual. Controlled vowels, disciplined consonants. She did not retreat. "You are informed for a stranger," he met her gaze. "I am informed enough to dislike preventable risk. Who told you my route?" He looked briefly past her shoulder toward the turning where water already gleamed black under gaslight. "Observation told me the route. Your name was spoken this afternoon by a clerk carrying Walsh papers and no umbrella. He cursed the rain and your punctuality in the same breath." That was plausible. Also polished. Ivy shifted the lantern from one hand to the other, feeling the warmth of trapped flame through the tin. "Why should my route concern you?" A pause, measured, not evasive. "Because you walk alone where you should not be obliged to." No flirtation, no softening, a plain statement of social fact, and one she could neither deny nor accept without cost. She opened the satchel, withdrew the spare lantern, and held it out to him. "If you intend to stand in rain issuing warnings, take this." He did not move at once. For the first time, composure flickered in his expression, not surprise at receiving an object, surprise at receiving trust in public. "It is a spare," she said. "Return it tomorrow at this hour if you mean to keep your station." His gloved hand closed around the lantern handle, careful not to touch her fingers. Up close she saw an old scar beginning near his jaw, and disappearing beneath collar linen, thin and pale as paper cut, deep by time. "Thank you, Miss Walsh." She drew her hand back. "The upper road, then." He stepped aside with the formal courtesy of a man in uniform, though no insignia marked him. The upper road. She walked. At the next corner she heard his boots strike the pavement behind her, steady and deliberate, always the same measured distance she had counted before. Not near enough to claim her, near enough to deter others. On Petrol Street, two clerks outside a gin shop looked up, began to grin at the sight of her soaked hem and work satchel, then saw the man behind her and straightened without a word. One muttered something to the other, and both turned away. Ivy did not look back again. At the rear gate of Walsh House, she set her hand on the iron latch and paused. The stranger had halted under the sycamore across the lane, lantern light cupped in his palm, face half shadow, posture unchanged. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, not certain why she said it. He gave a short bow. "Tomorrow." Then he crossed the lane, set a folded scrap on the flat stone of the gatepost in plain sight, and stepped back beneath the sycamore before she could speak. Inside, the corridor smelled of starch and extinguished coal. Mrs. Dobb took Ivy's cloak, noted the mud, and sent for hot water without comment. In her room, Ivy opened her satchel and drew out the folded scrap she had lifted from the gatepost and tucked beside her ledger rag, rough paper, dry despite the rain, with a single line in disciplined hand. "Upper Road first. Always." She held the note over the candle flame until it blackened and curled, then crushed the ash in her palm and washed it down the basin, watching grey water circle the drain while the house settled around her in familiar, controlled silence. The grey ribbon of ash spun once more and vanished, and Ivy kept her hands in the basin until the water went cold enough to sting her knuckles. She dried them on the rough linen towel, folded it square, and set it back exactly where Mrs. Dobb expected to find it. Order was a language in this house. Disorder was evidence. A soft knock came at her door before she had unpinned her hair. "Miss Ivy," the housemaid said through the panel, "your mother asks whether you will require the carriage tomorrow for Mr. Brigg." Ivy opened the door only as far as courtesy required. "Tell my mother I shall walk to the office." The maid hesitated, eyes dropping to Ivy's damp hem. "Yes, miss." When the girl had gone, Ivy sat at her narrow dressing table and unfastened the stitched pocket from inside her bodice to count her wages by candlelight. She counted twice, then slid the notes back into hiding. Her pulse had not settled. She told herself it was the walk in rain, the confrontation in the blue sitting room, the ceaseless arithmetic of survival. Not the way a man she did not know had said her name with formal care, as if he had practiced not to speak it carelessly. At breakfast, Lenora wore pearl grey and asked no questions about the mud on Ivy's boots. That was never mercy. That was inventory. Mr. Pollard arrived with a packet of copied marriage clauses and left it unopened beside Lenora's plate. Edwin stood by the window and pretended interest in weather while listening for weakness. "Mr. Brigg remains available at 2:00, Lenora said, breaking a roll in precise halves. "I remain unavailable," Ivy replied. Lenora buttered her half and took a bite before answering. "Then your wages may be directed toward your own lodging sooner than expected." Ivy lifted her cup. Cold tea again. "As you wish." Mr. Pollard cleared his throat without looking up. "Miss Walsh, I should caution against impulsive decisions." Ivy set her cup down. "I signed away an inheritance to secure direct pay for 1 year. Impulse is expensive, Mr. Pollard. I cannot afford it." Edwin made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been discomfort. Lenora did not react. She turned to the carriage ledger and entered 3 appointments in a clean hand that looked decorative until one read the words: Bellamy fitting, Brigg call, chapel attendance mandatory. Ivy left the table with her spine straight and her jaw tight enough to ache. The docks gave her breathing room only because numbers still obeyed rules. Cargo weights had to balance. Tonnage did not bend for gossip. By late afternoon, she had corrected 2 manifests and rewritten a bill of lading that young Mr. Pritchard had spoiled with careless transposition. Ink stained the side of her hand again. She welcomed the stain. It was earned, and it told the truth. When she stepped into the evening street, 2 clerks from neighbouring firms lingered near the lamp outside the tobacconist, hats tipped back, voices loud from ale. Ivy recognized them as men who never greeted women in daylight unless introduced. One looked pointedly at the frayed edge of her hem, dark where last night's rain had dried in a tide line. "Walsh keeps economy now," he said to his companion, not lowering his voice. "Even their ladies sweep the quay with their skirts." The other snorted. "Perhaps she seeks custom." Ivy did not break pace. She had learned the cost of visible hurt. But heat rose under her skin and then dropped away so quickly her fingers numbed around the satchel strap. Bootsteps sounded behind her, measured and unhurried. The men looked past her shoulders, and their expressions changed in one beat, from mockery to calculation. The first man shifted sideways, making space he had not intended to grant. The second found sudden interest in his boot buckle. The stranger did not address them. He came into the gaslight and stood at the curb with still authority, rain-dark coat plain as ever, hat brim low. His silence was not theatrical. It was final. The clerks turned away as if they had remembered urgent business elsewhere. Ivy stopped beneath the lamp, breath even, pulse not. "You have acquired a talent for timing, sir." He inclined his head. "I prefer uninteresting outcomes." "Uninteresting for whom?" "For everyone who arrives home intact." A reply pressed at her tongue and dissolved. She was aware of the seam at his collar, of the pale track of the old scar near his jaw, of the fact that no one on that street mistook him for prey, though he dressed as a labourer. He held out her spare lantern, polished glass dry despite the damp evening, and with it a folded paper, thick and neatly creased. "I said I would return it," he said. "I have added something of use." She took the lantern first. His gloved hand released the handle without brushing her skin. She took the folded sheet next. On the outside, in disciplined script, "Upper routes after 6 o'clock." Ivy opened it under the lamp. A map of side streets around street. Jude's and the docks, hand-drawn with clean lines and brief notes in the margin. Floodwater here in rain. Watch post after dark. Avoid coal carts at shift change. Whoever had drawn it knew patrol rhythms, drainage grades, and which alleys narrowed into blind turns. She looked up. "This is not guesswork." "No." "You walked all of it yourself." "Yes." For the first time, something like dryness touched her voice. "That is an industrious hobby." His mouth almost moved. Almost. "It serves." A carriage clattered past, wheels spraying thin grit. Ivy refolded the map with care and slid it inside her satchel between ledger boards so it would not crease. She should have offered thanks, and continued. She should have treated this as practical exchange and no more. Instead, she heard herself say, "You bow as if I outrank you." He gave a brief, formal bow then, exactly as she had accused. And when he straightened, she saw the smallest shift in his expression. Not amusement, not challenge, but recognition that she had noticed what others missed. "Good evening, Miss Walsh." "Good evening, sir." He stepped back to his customary distance. She resumed walking, and he followed as before, neither crowding nor absent, his stride adjusted to hers with military precision that denied itself acknowledgement. At the rear gate, she paused with her hand on the latch. "Tomorrow," she said. "Yes." Nothing in the word promised. Nothing in it withdrew. By Thursday, Ivy had begun leaving the office by the side door nearest the counting-house vault, because from there she could see both ends of the lane before turning towards St. Jude's. She told herself it was tactical prudence. It was also habit now, the kind formed before one admits it has formed. He waited near the church gate with the lantern lit before full dark. And this time, she did not start when she saw him. She merely measured the street, adjusted her satchel, and nodded once as she passed. He fell into step behind her at his respectful interval. They crossed Crown Lane where fishmongers washed slate tables with brine. The smell of salt and scales hung heavy under the gaslight. A naval courier on horseback cut through traffic, and Ivy, without thinking, muttered that the Admiralty packet was late by at least a day. 2 days, the stranger said quietly from behind her shoulder. A headwind off the downs held the packet ship outside Gravesend. She slowed half a pace. You are informed for a man who stands outside churches. I am informed for a man who listens. To whom? To men who complain when schedules fail. She did not pursue it. The answer was plausible and incomplete. She had become expert at living inside incomplete answers. At the apothecary on Milton Row, the queue had spilled into the street. Dock wives waiting for liniment, cough syrups, carbolic soap. Ivy joined the line for a bottle of tonic Mrs. Dobb had requested for a kitchen maid's persistent fever. The stranger remained across the road, beneath a shuttered bookseller's awning, hat brim low, gaze moving without haste over windows, corners, passing carts. A brewer's dray blocked the lane, and one of the apothecary apprentices stepped out to clear a path, muttering that he would miss the watch rotation and catch blame from that sharp one by the bridge. The stranger spoke before Ivy could. Third watch shifted 10 minutes later this week. Sergeant Bell changed it after the Tuesday disturbance. The apprentice blinked. Beg pardon, sir? 10 minutes. You will still make it if you take Mill Court. The boy stared 1 beat too long, then ducked his head. Thank you, sir. He hurried off, weaving through carts. Ivy kept her eyes on the apothecary door. A watchman at the corner glanced toward the awning and tipped 2 fingers to his cap. Evening, S. He cut the word short, coughed, and corrected. Evening. The stranger answered with a curt nod that accepted the correction without inviting further speech. Ivy felt the shift in her own breathing, the way one did when a puzzle piece clicked against another but did not lock. Labourer's coat. Formal diction. Knowledge of watch rotations, men, nearly calling him sir. She could have turned, asked directly, demanded a name and station. She did not. Demand required leverage, and leverage in her life was rationed more tightly than candles. 3 days passed before Lenora's pressure changed form. At breakfast, Mr. Pollard brought a jeweller's case with a ring intended for preliminary understanding with Mr. Brigg, and Lenora set the case in front of Ivy as if placing a salt cellar. You will wear it to chapel, Lenora said. Ivy opened the case, saw the heavy gold set with a stone too large for discretion, and closed it again. No. Lenora did not blink. This is not a request. Ivy slid the case across the linen toward Mr. Pollard. Then it is a mistake. Edwin exhaled sharply. Mr. Pollard looked at the case, then at Lenora, then at his cuff, choosing cowardice in real time. Lenora buttered her toast. You confuse defiance with strategy, she said. Ivy rose. I confuse nothing. She went to work with her stomach tight and her hands steady. That evening on the iron bridge above Walsh Wharf, wind drove spray up through the girders in cold bursts. Barges moved below like dark punctuation on black water. Ivy stopped midway to tighten the strap on her satchel. The stranger paused several paces back, then came forward only when a group of laughing clerks approached from the far side and filled the walkway. One of them jostled her shoulder as he passed. Beg pardon, miss, he said without meaning it. The stranger shifted just enough to place himself between Ivy and the trailing pair. No threat, no touch. A reallocation of space so efficient it looked like chance unless one watched closely. The men moved around him instinctively, eyes dropping, voices fading. When the bridge cleared, Ivy resumed walking. You intervene without speaking, she said. Speech is rarely required. For you, perhaps. For men who rely upon performance, yes, he said. For men who rely upon consequence, less so. She glanced at his hands as he adjusted the cuff of his glove. For a fraction of a second, where wet leather pulled away, she saw a shallow, pale groove around his ring finger, the unmistakable indentation left by a signet worn, long and recently removed. He tugged the glove down at once. They reached the far side of the bridge. A pair of constables stood by the warehouse arch, cloaks buttoned high against the wind. One nodded toward the stranger with habitual respect. Evenings. Again the correction, sharper this time. Evening, mate. Evening, he replied, voice neutral. Ivy stepped onto Petrol Street and felt, with unnerving clarity, that she stood near an undisclosed centre of gravity. Not danger, not safety exactly. Structure. The same sensation she had known as a girl when her father reviewed ledgers beside her and said nothing for long stretches. Yet every figure on the page seemed less likely to betray her. At the rear gate she turned before lifting the latch. "Sir," he waited. "If I am to accept your maps and your inconvenient timing, I require one plain fact. Are you in anyone's employ in this matter?" A pause. Honest, she thought, because he did not fill it quickly. Yes. Whose? "I cannot answer that tonight." Ivy held his gaze. His eyes were grey-green under the lamplight, clear, watchful, and entirely awake. Men who lied for pleasure seldom met a stare that long. "Then I shall ask again another evening," she said. "That is fair." She gave one short nod. "Good night." "Good night, Miss Walsh." Inside she climbed the servant's stair with ink on her cuffs, tonic in her satchel, and the folded map warm against her ledger from the heat of her hand. In the morning room she paused only long enough to turn her father's portrait back toward the fire. This time, when she left, she did not look behind to see whether someone would reverse it again. She had begun, quietly, to keep count of things that stayed. After the rear gate clicked shut behind her, and his low tomorrow faded into the wet dark, Ivy went first to the drawing room and turned Edmund Walsh's portrait back toward the room, setting it square with both hands until his gaze faced outward again. She had begun, quietly, to keep count of things that stayed, and as she stepped into the corridor, she heard voices carrying from the blue sitting room below, clipped and practical in the way this house reserved for other people's pain. Ivy paused at the top of the stairs with one hand on the banister and looked down through the carved rail. Lenora stood near the cold grate, gloves still on though she was indoors, while Mr. Pollard held his folio against his chest, as if the leather could shield him from involvement. Between them, hat crushed in both hands, stood a young dockhand Ivy recognized from Walsh Wharf. Tommy Reed, narrow-shouldered, 19 at most, with a torn sleeve dark at the cuff and a strip of linen knotted badly around his forearm. "He slipped on the chains slick by berth 3, the head clerk was saying from the doorway. "The cut is deep enough that he cannot return to loading by dawn." Lenora did not look at Tommy. "Then he cannot remain in our employ." The clerk shifted, startled. "Madam, he has worked 6 years." "He has bled on account books," Lenora replied. "Efficiency requires replacement, not sentiment. Dismiss him and deduct the spoiled paper from final wages." Tommy's fingers tightened around his hat until the brim buckled. He did not plead. Men on the docks learned early that pleading cost breath and bought little. Mr. Pollard cleared his throat, glanced once at Lenora, and said nothing. Ivy came down the stairs before she had decided to move. Her steps were even, her chin level, her pulse hammering in the hollow of her throat. Lenora turned only when Ivy reached the threshold. "You were not summoned," Lenora said. Ivy looked at Tommy first. His face had gone pale under river grit, his eyes fixed on the floorboards to avoid appearing insolent. "Who tied that bandage?" "Jory at the crane," he said, voice rough. Best he could. Can you close your hand? He tried. 2 fingers trembled and would not fold. Lenora's tone remained bored. You may inspect him if it amuses you. It alters nothing. Ivy set her satchel on the side table. He needs a surgeon and a bed that is not a dock plank. He needs accountability, Lenora said. Walsh Shipping is not a charity ward. Ivy met her mother's gaze. No, it is a business that does not run without hands. Lenora lifted one shoulder. Then purchase yourself a conscience from your wages, if you are determined to perform one. Ivy turned to Tommy. Go to the rear kitchen and wait by the stove. Tell Mrs. Dobb Miss Walsh sent you for hot water and clean cloth. Tommy hesitated, eyes darting to Lenora, then to Ivy. Now, Ivy said. He went. Lenora watched him leave, then drew off one glove finger by finger. You mistake your position. I understand my position exactly. Ivy picked up her satchel. That is why I will spend my own money. She did not wait for permission to depart. She walked through the service passage, found Tommy hunched on a bench with steam rising from a chipped basin at his feet, and wrapped his forearm herself with linen, torn from one of her old petticoat bands, while Mrs. Dobb pretended not to notice where the cloth had come from. When the bandage wickered through in less than a minute, Ivy felt her jaw lock. Can you walk? She asked. Tommy nodded once. She took him out by the rear gate into a night that smelled of wet brick and fish oil, her lantern throwing a narrow amber tunnel over rutted stone. At Milton Row, the apothecary shutters were half closed, and the apprentice was dousing lamps. Ivy set 2 coins on the counter before he could refuse, asked for carbolic and clean gauze, and learned the surgeon had already gone to a confinement in Wapping. She bought what she could and led Tommy onward toward a charity surgery, behind St. Jude's, where discharged sailors paid in labour when they could not pay in cash. The duty surgeon, a woman with iron-grey hair and sleeves rolled to the elbow, looked once at Tommy's arm and once at Ivy's dress, and asked no useless questions. He will keep the hand if infection stays off, she said while stitching. He will not haul cargo for a month. A month, Ivy repeated. He needs broth, rest, and someone to make sure he does not tear this open trying to prove himself useful. Ivy thanked her, counted out nearly all the notes she had hidden that week, and still came short of the bed fee for even 3 nights in the adjoining lodging room. She stood in the doorway with her purse open and the arithmetic stark in her palm. Rent for safety, medicine, food, candles, paper. The surgeon waited without impatience. Tommy stared at his boots, shame and pain warring in the set of his mouth. Ivy reached into the inner pocket of her satchel and closed her fingers around the last gold cufflink her father had given her on her 17th birthday, plain and heavy, engraved with the tiny compass rose he used on private ledgers. She had carried it for months as if metal could anchor memory. She placed it on the surgeon's desk beside the coins. This is fair value, she said. The surgeon picked it up, weighed it, and nodded once. It is more than fair. Then keep the excess against his meals. Tommy looked up sharply. Miss Walsh, no, I can sleep under the awning by berth. You can sleep indoors, Ivy said. You can return to work with a hand that closes. That is the only account that matters tonight. She signed the lodging register with a steady hand, left instructions with the keeper that any additional charges were to be sent to Walsh Shipping under her name, and stepped into the lane with less money than she had ever carried and a strange, clean quiet in her chest. The lantern flame wavered in the wind. She had not looked for the stranger once through the long circuit from house to surgery. She had no room left for watchfulness. The next evening, in the small hours between shift changes, she learned exactly how hunger sounded. It was her own stomach reminding her she had given away the coin meant for supper, and she answered it with a heel of bread bought from a cart as she crossed towards the wharf office. Rain had started again, soft but persistent, turning the planks slick. She intended only to leave the apothecary bottle in Tommy's locker and go home before Lenora noticed the hour. The warehouse side door stood ajar, a thin bar of light cutting across the dark yard. Ivy stopped under the eave and listened. No voices, only the scrape of brush on floorboards, rhythmic, deliberate. She pushed the door with her fingertips and slipped inside. At first she saw only the bucket and the trail of diluted red water running toward the drain in narrow streams. Then she saw the man on one knee with his sleeves rolled, labourer's coat set aside on a crate, shirt dark at the cuffs where he had plunged his hands into the bucket again and again. He was scrubbing the boards where Tommy had bled after collapsing near the ledgers at shift change, jaw set, movements controlled by force of will rather than disgust. A second pail stood near him, filled with rags already wrung nearly dry. He looked up. Lantern light caught his eyes and held there, grey-green gone, startlingly clear. He did not startle to find her, though surprise flashed once before discipline sealed it away. "You should not be here alone at this hour, Miss Walsh," he said. "You are here," she answered. "I am occupied." "I can see that." She set her lantern on the nearest desk and crossed the floor. "Give me the clean rag." He rose halfway, as if to prevent it. "No." "Do not waste time arguing." For a beat they looked at one another in the dim office where her father had once corrected her pen grip and praised neat sums. Then he handed her the rag without another word. They worked in silence, kneeling opposite each other, passing bucket and cloth, clearing the floor until only wet grain lines remained and the metallic smell had thinned to soap and damp oak. His hands were strong and precise, with old calluses across the palm not earned from a clerk's pen. The signet indentation on his ring finger showed again when water slicked his skin. He tugged the cuff down only after he noticed her glance. When the boards were clean, Ivy wrung the last rag and hung it over the bucket rim. "Tommy is stitched and lodged behind St. Jude's for 3 nights. He needs broth and rest." His expression changed then, not softened, but struck through, as if something she had done had reached a place he had fortified. "You paid for that?" "Yes." "With what?" She picked up her lantern. "With what was mine." He stood fully now, taller than she had first measured, shoulders squared with soldier's economy. "Miss Walsh," she cut him off with a small shake of her head. "Do not thank me. If you wish to repay, make certain no one dismisses him before he can hold a rope." His voice dropped, rougher than she had ever heard it. "I can do that. I thought you might." She turned toward the door, then looked back once. He was still watching her, wet sleeves rolled, face unreadable except for that same shaken recognition he had failed to hide. For the first time since St. Jude's steps, she wondered not who employed him, but what decision he had been trying to keep, and why her choice had unsettled it. She reached the house well past midnight. The rear passage was dark. Even Mrs. Dobb had gone to bed. Ivy climbed the servant's stair slowly, every muscle heavy, skirts smelling faintly of carbolic and river damp. At the first landing she heard voices ahead, low but distinct, carrying from Lenora's study where a strip of light showed under the door. She would have passed on if Mr. Pollard had not spoken her name. "She has become unpredictable," he murmured. "If she refuses again, we lose Friday." Lenora answered in the flat tone she used when discussing linen inventories. "The girl will sign by Friday. Her father's sentimental clause is void once she is married. I have tolerated this employment farce long enough." Ivy stopped with one hand on the stair rail. Wood pressed hard into her palm. Her pulse jumped so sharply she felt it in her teeth. "Mr." Pollard lowered his voice further. She caught only fragments. "Executor, objection." If Hale appears, Lenora gave a brief, dismissive laugh. Captain Rowan Hale can keep playing porter in muddy boots, but he will not overturn my household. Captain Rowan Hale. The name landed with physical force. Ivy's fingers went colder than the banister iron, though sweat dampened the back of her neck. Porter in muddy boots. The map hand. The watchman swallowing, sir? The signet mark rubbed raw. Not a street guardian by chance. A man placed. A man withstanding enough to be named as a threat in her mother's private room. Mr. Pollard said, "If the original paper is produced." "It will not be," Lenora snapped, then returned to her measured register. "I control this house, the trust correspondence and access to every relevant file. You will prepare the final schedule and bring witnesses. We proceed." Silence followed, then the scrape of chair legs. Ivy stepped back into shadow before the latch moved, breath held shallow to keep her stays from creaking. Pollard passed down the corridor with his folio clutched tight, eyes on the carpet, and did not see her in the alcove beside the linen press. Lenora remained inside, turning pages with calm, methodical taps. Ivy stayed still until the study light went dark. Only then did she climb the remaining stairs, one hand trailing the wall because her fingertips had not regained feeling. In her room, she closed the door, set the lantern down, and stood without moving, while her heartbeat settled from gallop to hammer to something almost steady. Captain Rowan Hale. Executor. Clause. Friday. Each word arranged itself against the next, like iron bars. She did not cry. Something harder than tears formed, quiet and unyielding, while dawn's first pale line touched the edge of her window, and the house around her slept, as if nothing had shifted at all. She did not undress. She crossed the room with her stays still laced, drew the carpet bag from beneath the bed, and set it open on the coverlet as the first pale light along the window frame sharpened from grey to pearl. 2 gowns, 1 plain day dress, under linen, account nibs wrapped in cloth, her wage notes from the false drawer, and the small Bible her father had given her when she first entered the office at 12. She added the spare lantern last, cushioned in muslin. The bag looked both too small for a life and large enough to condemn her if discovered. On the landing outside, the house remained silent in that thin hour before servants stirred the grates. Ivy took the bag in one hand and her shoes in the other, and stepped into the corridor without candlelight, counting boards by memory to avoid the creaks. She went first to the morning room. Edmund Walsh's portrait still faced outward from where she had set it earlier, grey eyes calm in the dim. Beneath the portrait, the wall cabinet held rolled route maps and old freight charts. Her father had once corrected her posture there and said, lightly, that paper survived only where people expected wood. She set down the bag, pressed her thumb under the cabinet's lower moulding, and felt it give. A narrow panel slid back by an inch. Behind it, wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine, lay 3 ledgers and a sealed packet with her father's private mark. Her breath caught once, hard and quiet. Pollard had said original paper would not be produced. Lenora had said she controlled every relevant file. Ivy lifted the bundle free, weighed it in both hands, and understood exactly what had been hidden and why. The twine had been knotted in her father's style, a sailor's hitch that would not slip unless released in the right direction. She did not open the packet there. She put the ledgers into the carpet bag and slid the panel shut. Footsteps sounded at the far end of the corridor, soft but distinct. Mrs. Dobb, carrying ashpans before dawn. The housekeeper stopped when she saw Ivy with the bag. Her lined face did not change, but her eyes moved once to the satchel shape beneath the cloth, and then back to Ivy's face. "You are leaving, miss?" "Yes." Mrs. Dobb set the ashpan down on the runner. Will you be coming back this morning? I do not know. A beat passed in which 30 years of household discipline held, then bent by 1 degree. Mrs. Dobb reached into her apron pocket and produced a ring of smaller keys, selecting one brass key with a green thread tied through its bow. Postern gate sticks in damp, she said. Lift and turn at the same time. It does not squeal if opened slowly. Ivy took the key. Thank you. Mrs. Dobb lifted the ash pan again. Your father paid my son's apprenticeship when no one else would. I remember my accounts. Ivy's throat tightened. She nodded once and moved on, and she did not go to Lenora's door. She went to the blue sitting room instead, where Pollard's folio copies had been left in last night's hurry. The grate remained cold. On the side table lay a stack of draft marriage schedules, one page weighted by Lenora's glove clasp. Ivy scanned the top sheet, took 2 pages bearing Pollard's hand and dates, and folded them into the inner pocket of her cloak. At the escritoire, she found the carriage ledger open to yesterday's entries, and tore out the page where Lenora had ordered the footman away from Walsh Wharf. Evidence that removal of escort had been deliberate. Evidence that control had method, not accident. She paused only once, pen in hand over the blotter. Then, she wrote a single line on clean paper and left it centered on the desk. I have filed under my own name. No apology, no appeal. By first light, she had crossed 2 bridges and reached Chancery Hall with her hem dark from street wash and her fingers stiff from carrying the bag. The hall steps were already crowded with clerks, petitioners, widows in plain wool, and merchants arguing over stamped copies. Coal smoke hung low under the stone arch. Ivy joined the queue at filing room B and kept one hand on the carpetbag strap, thumb hooked under the leather seam where the ledgers rested. When her turn came, the clerk behind the grill looked at her gloves, then at her face, then at the bag. Name: Ivy Walsh. Representation: myself. His pen paused. Madam, this office does not advise. I did not request advice. I request filing. He gave the look of a man accustomed to sending women away politely. Cause: emergency petition to preserve estate documents, suspend unauthorized marriage settlement tied to trust control, and compel production of executor correspondence withheld by household manager. His brows rose despite himself. Household manager. My mother. The clerk tapped his pen against the inkstone. Supporting papers. Ivy untied the bag and laid out one by one the items in disciplined order. 2 draft schedules in Pollard's hand, the torn carriage ledger page, 3 original harbour ledgers wrapped in oilskin, and the sealed packet bearing Edmund Walsh's private mark. She kept her fingers off the seal. The clerk's posture shifted from dismissal to caution. He called for a senior registrar. An older woman in black bombazine came to the grill, read the first page, then the second, then looked directly at Ivy. Who prepared this petition language for you? My father taught me to read contracts and write manifests that survive hostile weather, Ivy said. The structure is mine. The registrar held out her hand for the sealed packet. Ivy did not release it. Not without receipt and seal witnessed, she said. A faint, almost invisible approval crossed the woman's face. You shall have both. 3 desks over, a side door opened. Mr. Pollard entered with Lenora, both moving faster than protocol usually permitted, and behind them came Edwin, pale with morning haste. Lenora had dressed in dark silk with no jewellery, as if austerity might pass for innocence. She saw Ivy at the grill and stopped only half a second before resuming her controlled pace. Miss Walsh has no authority to file independent action, Pollard said to the registrar. She is emotionally distressed and in the influence of bad counsel. Ivy turned, spine straight, palms cold. "Name the counsel." Pollard did not answer. Lenora stepped forward. Her voice was flat, almost bored. "Ivy, come home. You're making a spectacle." Ivy looked at her mother and felt the old reflex to shrink, to defer until later, to survive the room by becoming smaller than its strongest will. Then she felt the weight of the bag strap in her hand, the key Mrs. Dobb had given her, the oilskin ledgers her father had hidden where only touch and memory could find them. "I decline," she said. The registrar lifted a hand before Lenora could speak again. "This filing will proceed to morning chamber for preliminary review. If you wish to oppose, madam, you may oppose on record." Lenora's mouth tightened by 1 degree. "You are indulging hysteria." The registrar's tone did not change. "I am applying procedure." By mid-morning they stood in a narrow chamber lined with dark benches and high windows clouded by soot. Ivy sat alone at one table with her bag at her feet. Lenora and Pollard sat opposite, heads bent in urgent conference. Edwin remained behind them, looking anywhere but at Ivy. The air smelled of damp wool and sealing wax. A clock ticked from somewhere behind the panelling. The usher called 3 names for testimony from Walsh Shipping. None came. Then the door at the rear opened and a man entered in a plain, dark coat, carrying a document case. Ivy recognized his stride before his face lifted fully into the chamber light. Rowan. He did not look toward her first. He crossed to the center rail, removed his gloves, and handed credentials to the clerk with a practiced motion. The clerk read, straightened, and passed the papers up to the magistrate. Pollard rose halfway. "Objection. This witness has been engaged in deceptive proximity to my client's household." Rowan turned then, and Ivy saw that he had not worn the labourer's coat. His linen was plain but immaculate. At his cuff, a narrow signet ring had returned to the finger where its mark had been. His scar showed clearly above the collar, no longer hidden by rough cloth. The magistrate looked down over his spectacles. "State your name and standing." Rowan's voice carried without force, measured as ever. "I am Captain Rowan Hale, now Viscount Hale, executor of Edmund Walsh's estate, and his final wish was this: her choice first, always." Silence followed, not dramatic, simply complete. Even the clock seemed to pause between ticks. Ivy felt the sentence move through everything that had happened in the past weeks and reorder it. The mapped streets, the watchful distance, the refusal to answer too soon, the men who almost called him sir, the restraint that had looked like secrecy because it had been duty. He had not been sent to steer her. He had been charged to wait until she acted freely and then stand where the law could see him. Lenora spoke first, sharp with contained fury. That clause was sentimental and non-binding. Rowan did not look at her. The clause is binding, attested, and filed in duplicate at the War Office Registry, and with Chancery under seal. The duplicate receipt is in the packet Miss Walsh produced this morning. Pollard's face drained of colour. "That is procedurally irregular." "It is procedurally fatal," the magistrate said, reaching for the packet. Ivy sat very still while seals were checked, signatures matched, and dates read into record. Her hands had stopped trembling. Across the chamber, Rowan looked at her once, only once, and gave the slightest inclination of his head, formal as their first night at St. Jude's, but stripped of disguise now. Not permission, recognition. When the magistrate ordered interim preservation of all Walsh Trust assets and immediate audit of household withdrawals pending full hearing, Lenora made a small sound in her throat that was not outrage and not fear, but the first crack in administrative certainty. Edwin sank onto the bench as if his knees had failed him. Pollard reached for his folio and missed the clasp. The usher called the next matter. Proceedings moved on with bureaucratic indifference because courts were built to absorb private catastrophes and continue. Ivy rose, gathered her carpet bag, and stepped into the corridor where noonlight struck the stone in pale bands. Behind her, voices resumed in low legal tones. Ahead, the hall doors stood open to the city and its wet, relentless noise. Rowan came to stand at her side, not touching, leaving the same respectful distance he had kept on every night road. "Miss Walsh," he said quietly, "you may return to Walsh House under court order if you choose, or secure separate lodging under estate protection this afternoon. The choice is yours." For the first time that day, she allowed herself one full breath. "Then I choose," she said, and began to walk toward the steps with him beside her. On the top step, with the courthouse noise rolling around them like tide against stone, Ivy stopped and turned to him. "I will not return to Walsh House," she said. "Not for shelter, not for permission. I will return once, with officers, for my things and my father's portrait. Then I will go to the office." Rowan gave one measured nod. "I can arrange both within the hour." "You arranged much already, Captain." His expression did not shift, but his gaze held hers without disguise now. "I arranged what your father required. You arranged the rest." The sentence settled in her chest with a steadier weight than comfort. It was respect, not rescue. She inclined her head, then descended the steps with him beside her, while clerks and petitioners made way in small, startled movements once they recognized her name from the chamber call. By late afternoon, 2 Chancery officers in dark coats accompanied them to Walsh House. The postern key Mrs. Dobb had given Ivy was still warm from her hand when she returned it, brass and green thread lying on the kitchen table between them. "You kept your account," Ivy said quietly. Mrs. Dobb looked at the officers, then back at Ivy. "And you kept yours." She lowered her voice. "Your note was found." Mrs. Walsh read it twice and burned it in the grate. That resolved itself cleanly in Ivy's mind. No dramatic speech, no torn paper waved in anyone's face. Only acknowledgement that Lenora had received the one line and understood it. In the morning room, Edmund Walsh's portrait had been turned toward the wall again. Ivy crossed the carpet without haste, lifted the frame, and set it facing outward for the last time in that house. She did not leave it there. She wrapped it in a wool blanket under the officer's witness and had it carried to the counting-house wagon with her carpet bag, the spare lantern, and the map Rowan had drawn. From the cedar chest, she took the remaining clothes she had packed. From her dressing table, she took the account nibs and the half-candles. From the washstand, she took nothing because the false drawer was empty now, wages already in her possession, and entered on record. Lenora waited in the blue sitting room when Ivy came downstairs. Pollard rigid at her side, Edwin near the window with his hands clasped behind him so tightly that his knuckles blanched. "You have made your point," Lenora said, as if discussing delayed tea. "You may stop this now and come home." Ivy stood at the threshold, no longer needing to step farther in. "No." Lenora's eyes moved once to Rowan, who remained by the door with the officers, gloves in hand. "Captain Hale," she said, and made his name sound like a stain she expected someone else to remove. "You entered my household under false appearance." Rowan answered in the same even tone he had used in court. "I entered public streets in lawful fulfillment of executor duty." Pollard found his voice. "This can still be settled privately." One of the officers unfolded a paper and read the interim order aloud. "Preservation of estate assets, immediate suspension of marriage instruments, transfer of trust control pending audit, and prohibition against interference with petitioner lodging or movement." Each clause dropped into the room like a latch closing. When the reading ended, Lenora's face remained composed, but the boredom was gone. Something narrower had replaced it. Ivy looked once at Edwin. "You told me gratitude was due for establishment." He swallowed. "I said what I was told to say." "I know." She turned away before he could add anything else, and if there was a confession waiting behind his eyes, it never came. Outside, the air smelled of wet stone and horse sweat. Ivy climbed into the wagon beside her father's wrapped portrait and held the frame through every jolt of the road. Walsh Shipping received her that evening through the front entrance, not the servants' stair. The same marble threshold she had crossed as a child now held a cluster of partners, clerks, and 2 merchants from the River Exchange, men who had looked through her for months as if she were a temporary inconvenience with ink-stained cuffs. The auditor from Chancery stood near the ledger table with a sealed packet and a stern patience that made everyone else stand straighter. Mr. Harbury, senior partner, cleared his throat when she entered. "Miss Walsh." He had always made the words sound ceremonial and distant. Tonight, they sounded careful. The auditor broke the seal, read findings from the preliminary inspection, and entered each into the office register with witnesses present. The forged amendment to Edmund Walsh's trust instructions was invalid. Diverted trust disbursements were traceable through household accounts. The wage for claim contract Ivy had signed would be reviewed for enforceability under concealment of executor notice and withheld trust access, and, pending full hearing, operational authority reverted to Ivy Walsh as principal acting heir under executor oversight. No one applauded. This was not a ballroom. But the silence that followed had a different texture from the silences she had known there before. Men looked directly at her now, some with embarrassment, some with relief, some with the practical recalibration of people who had just learned where power actually sat. Harbury bowed a little stiffly. "Miss Walsh, the keys." He placed the office ring in her palm. Brass for warehouse, iron for records room, 2 smaller steel keys for correspondence cabinets. She closed her fingers around them and felt the ridges bite her skin. "Thank you," she said. Across the room, young Pritchard, the clerk whose sums she had corrected in secret for weeks, stepped forward with reddened ears and a folded sheet. "Miss Walsh, I owe a statement. It was I who spoke your route in the rain outside the print shop. Not to betray, only foolishly. I heard later who might have been listening." Ivy took the paper. "And now?" "Now I submit this to the audit," he said, voice shaking. "On Mrs. Walsh's order, the footman collection for your evening return was removed from carriage entries for 3 consecutive days. I copied those entries." She handed the statement to the auditor without comment. External report. Outcome recorded. At the back of the hall, Tommy Reed stood with his left arm in a clean sling and a colour returning to his face. Beside him was the iron-grey surgeon from St. Jude's lodgings, coat buttoned high, observant and unsentimental. "Miss Walsh," Tommy said, stepping forward carefully. "I came to return what was not mine." He held out a small cloth purse. "The keeper said there was surplus after bed and broth once I was moved to my sister's room. Your cufflink covered more than needed." Ivy opened the purse. Her father's gold cufflink lay inside, polished by someone's rough care, the tiny compass rose, still visible. She looked up at the surgeon. The woman gave a brisk nod. "I keep fair books." Ivy closed her hand around the cufflink and felt, for one brief beat, that she was standing in 2 times at once. Her father fastening this at her cuff with a quiet joke about True North, and this crowded office where truth had finally been entered in ink, no one could turn to the wall. "Tommy," she said, "your position remains if you still wish it when your hand closes." He swallowed hard. "I do, miss." "Then report to inventory until the surgeon clears the rope work." The The surgeon approved with another short nod. 1 month. 3 days passed in hearings, inventories, and signatures. The forged amendment was struck from the trust record. Pollard resigned from Walsh Matters before formal censure could be entered. He sent one letter requesting return of personal papers. Ivy instructed that his copies be delivered by messenger, and his access ended at the door. Lenora accepted a court-defined annuity secured against non-operational assets and permanent removal from management authority. She sent no message to Ivy after the order was sealed. If regret existed, it never entered evidence. On the 4th evening, as dusk thinned to violet over the wharf roofs, Ivy stood at the reopened office doors, while the last clerks departed, and the gas lamps along Petrel Street lit one by one. The portrait had been rehung inside her father's room, facing the desk. The original ledgers and sealed packet were lodged in Chancery Archive under receipt. Duplicate extracts sat in the records cabinet she had locked herself. The torn carriage page and draft marriage schedules had been marked as exhibits and returned in certified copies to the office file. The spare lantern hung on a peg by the entrance, cleaned and ready. Rowan's hand-drawn map lay folded in her top drawer, not as warning now, but as provenance, proof of the nights when truth moved in plain coat and muddy boots. She heard his steps before she saw him, steady on the stone approach. He wore a dark coat cut to his station now, signet ring plain at his hand, scar visible and unhidden. No disguise, no distance widened by pretense. He stopped beside her, close enough to speak softly, not touching. "Miss Walsh, it appears you no longer require protection by subterfuge." She turned the keys once in her hand, then stilled them. The city smell of brine and coal wrapped around them. Behind her, the office breathed with the quiet of completed work. "Rowan," she said, the name new in her mouth and entirely right. "I never required subterfuge. I required truth and time to choose." His rare smile came then, and it transformed him from disciplined reserve into something warmer and unexpectedly young, as if the years he had spent standing watch had loosened by one deliberate degree. "Then I have one question left," he said. "Do you still require an escort home?" She stepped down from the threshold, moved to stand beside him on equal stone, and offered him neither gratitude nor surrender, only the unhurried answer that belonged to her. "Yes, if you walk beside me." He inclined his head once, and together they turned towards the upper road.